Women over 60. 5 signs men give before they cheat and most women miss. Barbara sat across from her sister in stunned silence, still processing the discovery she'd made 2 days earlier. At 69, she'd thought she was past the point of being blindsided by betrayal. She'd been with Martin for 3 years, living together for the past 18 months. And then she'd accidentally seen a text message on his phone that revealed he'd been having an affair for at least 6 months. The worst part, Barbara told her sister, her voice shaking, is that when I look back now, the signs were everywhere. I just didn't see them. Or maybe I didn't want to see them. He changed so many things about his behavior, and I explained every single one away. Her sister asked gently, "What signs?" Barbara's list was long. Martin had suddenly become obsessed with his appearance after years of not caring much. He'd started going to the gym religiously. He'd bought new clothes. He'd become protective of his phone in ways he'd never been before. He'd picked fights with Barbara over small things that had never bothered him previously. He'd become emotionally distant while simultaneously being more critical of her. And perhaps most tellingly, their intimate life had changed dramatically. Less frequent, less connected, almost perfunctory when it did happen. Every single one of those changes I had an explanation for, Barbara said. He's taking better care of himself. That's good for his health. He's private about his phone. He deserves boundaries. He's been stressed, and that's why he's irritable. Our sex life has changed because we're older. I explained away every red flag until I couldn't anymore. This is the pattern that women over 60 need to understand. Men rarely cheat impulsively with no warning. There are almost always behavioral changes that precede infidelity. The problem is that women either don't recognize these signs or actively explain them away because confronting the possibility of betrayal is too painful. So they ignore the evidence until the affair is discovered, and then they look back and realize the signs had been there all along. Subscribe to this channel right now because we're about to identify the 5 specific signs that men give before they cheat. Signs that most women miss or misinterpret. These aren't vague feelings or paranoia. These are concrete behavioral changes that researchers and therapists have identified as consistent predictors of infidelity. Understanding these signs won't prevent all betrayal, but it will help you recognize when something is fundamentally wrong, so you can address it before the damage is irreparable.
Sign number 1. He suddenly becomes obsessed with his appearance after years of not prioritizing it. There's a difference between gradually improving self-care and a sudden dramatic shift in attention to appearance. When a man who's been comfortable with his appearance for years suddenly becomes intensely focused on how he looks, joining a gym, buying new clothes, changing his grooming habits, losing weight urgently, it often signals that he's trying to attract someone or impress someone new. Dr. Ruth Houston, infidelity expert, explains that sudden appearance changes are one of the most reliable early indicators of an affair. When someone is being seen through fresh eyes, the eyes of someone new who finds them attractive, they become hyper-aware of their appearance in ways they haven't been with a long-term partner who already knows what they look like. Linda noticed this change in Thomas. At 65, Thomas had been comfortable with his appearance. He dressed casually, didn't worry much about his weight, was content with his salt and pepper hair. Then, suddenly, at age 67, Thomas joined an expensive gym and started going religiously. He bought entirely new wardrobes. He started using hair products he'd never used before. He became preoccupied with his weight in a way Linda had never seen before. Linda's initial reaction was positive. I thought it was great that he was taking better care of himself. I encouraged it. But looking back, after discovering Thomas's affair, Linda realized the changes hadn't been about health or self-improvement. They'd been about attracting and impressing the woman he was seeing at his gym. The key distinction is this: gradual self-improvement that includes your partner. Let's both start eating healthier, or want to go for walks together, is normal and healthy. Sudden, dramatic solo changes that exclude you and seem focused on attractiveness rather than health are warning signs. Margaret experienced this differently with Robert. Robert had always been well-groomed, but suddenly he became obsessive about it. He'd spend 30 minutes getting ready to go to the grocery store. He'd check his appearance constantly. He started wearing cologne every day when he'd previously only worn it for special occasions. When Margaret commented on the changes, Robert became defensive. "I'm just trying to take care of myself. Is that a problem?" That defensiveness was itself a red flag. If the changes were genuinely just about self-care, why would he be defensive about her noticing? Patricia saw similar changes in David. At 68, David suddenly started caring intensely about his clothes. He'd ask Patricia's opinion on outfits for situations that had never warranted that level of concern before. He'd started shopping for clothes alone, coming home with styles that seemed younger and more fashionable than his usual preferences. When Patricia found receipts for expensive clothing purchases, David explained he was trying to look more professional for work, despite being semi-retired and rarely having professional obligations. Here's the pattern to watch for: sudden, dramatic changes in appearance that seem focused on attractiveness, that exclude your involvement, and that come with defensiveness when you notice or comment. This is especially significant if your intimate life has declined while his focus on appearance has increased. He's putting in effort for someone, just not for you.
Sign number 2. He becomes intensely protective of his phone and creates new patterns of privacy. Everyone deserves some privacy, even in intimate relationships, but there's a difference between healthy boundaries and secretive behavior that represents a fundamental shift from previous patterns. When a man who's previously been casual about his phone suddenly treats it like classified information, something has changed, and that something is usually another woman. Dorothy noticed this shift with Michael. For 2 years, Michael had been casual about his phone. He'd leave it lying around. He'd hand it to Dorothy to check messages while he was driving. He had no password protection. Then suddenly, everything changed. Michael put a password on his phone and wouldn't tell Dorothy what it was. He started taking his phone everywhere, even to the bathroom. He'd leave the room to answer calls. He'd angle his screen away from Dorothy when texting. When Dorothy asked about the changes, Michael became angry. "Why do I need to justify wanting privacy? Are you going to start monitoring me now? That's controlling behavior." Notice the deflection. Michael reframed Dorothy's reasonable question about sudden behavior changes as Dorothy being controlling. This is a classic manipulation tactic, making you feel guilty for noticing obvious red flags. Dr. Shirley Glass, infidelity researcher, identified this pattern of increased secrecy as one of the most reliable indicators of an affair. She calls it creating walls instead of windows, shifting from transparency to opacity, from including your partner in your digital life to actively excluding them. Carol experienced this with Kenneth. Kenneth had always been open about his texts and emails. Carol wasn't monitoring him, but if a message came through while Kenneth was occupied, he'd ask Carol to check it and let him know who it was from. Suddenly, Kenneth became protective. He'd grab his phone quickly whenever a notification came through. He changed his notification settings so messages didn't display on his lock screen. He started deleting his text history regularly, explaining that he was trying to keep his phone organized. When Carol found this suspicious and said so, Kenneth accused her of not trusting him. "If you trusted me, you wouldn't be questioning my phone habits. This relationship can't work without trust." Again, notice the reversal. Michael was engaging in suspicious behavior, but he made Carol's response to that behavior into the problem. Helen saw similar patterns with Richard, but with a twist. Richard started spending extensive time on social media, which he'd barely used before. He'd be on his phone constantly, scrolling and smiling. When Helen would ask what was so interesting, Richard would minimize it. Just looking at nonsense, nothing important. But his behavior suggested otherwise. Whatever was on that phone was capturing his attention in ways that Helen no longer did. Barbara's experience with Martin was even more blatant. Martin started leaving the room whenever his phone rang. He'd close browser windows quickly when Barbara walked into the room. He changed all his passwords without explanation. When Barbara commented on these changes, Martin responded with anger. "I'm entitled to privacy. Just because we're in a relationship doesn't mean you get access to everything." That's technically true. Everyone deserves privacy. But sudden, dramatic changes in privacy patterns, especially combined with defensiveness and anger when questioned, indicate that privacy has become secrecy, and secrecy is usually hiding something. Here's the pattern. Previous openness shifting to sudden secrecy. Phone behaviors that seem protective rather than casual. Defensiveness or anger when you notice or comment on the changes. And critically, exclusion. You're being actively excluded from areas of his life that were previously shared or at least not hidden. Sign number 3. He picks fights with you over minor issues and becomes increasingly critical. This pattern confuses many women because it seems illogical. If he's interested in someone else, why would he become more negative and critical rather than just pulling away quietly? But there's a psychological reason for this behavior. When a man is developing feelings for someone else, he needs to justify that interest to himself. He does this by rewriting the narrative of his primary relationship, finding fault, focusing on negatives, and creating conflict that proves the relationship isn't working. Dr. John Gottman's research identifies increased criticism and contempt as predictors of relationship failure. But what many people don't realize is that sudden increases in these behaviors can also predict infidelity. The man who's emotionally investing elsewhere needs to justify that investment by convincing himself, and eventually you, that the primary relationship is problematic. Patricia experienced this with David. For 3 years, David had been generally content and easygoing. Small annoyances didn't bother him. But suddenly, everything Patricia did seemed to irritate David. The way she loaded the dishwasher was wrong. Her conversational style was too long-winded. Her housekeeping wasn't up to his standards. Her cooking was too repetitive. Patricia was confused and hurt. She tried harder to meet David's apparent expectations, but nothing satisfied him. Looking back after discovering David's affair, Patricia understood. David hadn't genuinely been bothered by those things. He'd been picking fights to create distance and to justify his emotional disconnection. Linda experienced something similar with Thomas. Thomas began criticizing aspects of Linda that had never bothered him before. Her relationship with her daughter, her volunteer commitments, her social plans with friends. He'd frame these criticisms as concerns. "I'm just worried that you're spreading yourself too thin," or "I think your daughter is too dependent on you." But the subtext was clear. Linda wasn't meeting his needs because she was focused on other relationships. These criticisms served multiple purposes. They created conflict that justified Thomas's emotional distance. They made Linda feel insecure and less likely to question his behavior. And they positioned Thomas as the dissatisfied party who had legitimate grievances. Carol noticed that Kenneth started picking fights right before situations where Carol would normally expect connection. Before a planned weekend together, Kenneth would start an argument that would create tension throughout the trip. Before an important family event, Kenneth would criticize something about Carol's family, creating discord. In retrospect, Carol realized Kenneth was creating distance during times when he'd be expected to be emotionally present. Margaret experienced the criticism in a different way. Robert started comparing Margaret unfavorably to other women. "Susan always looks so put together." Or, "My coworker is so easygoing, never stresses about anything." These comparisons, always framed as casual observations, were actually Robert beginning to rewrite his view of Margaret as insufficient. Dr. Shirley Glass explains that people engaged in affairs often engage in what she calls comparative thinking, constantly comparing their partner to the affair partner in ways that favor the affair partner. This comparison helps justify the betrayal. Here's the pattern: sudden increase in criticism about things that never bothered him before. Picking fights, especially before times when connection would be expected. Comparing you unfavorably to other women. Creating a narrative that the relationship is problematic. All of this serves to justify his emotional investment elsewhere and to create the distance he needs to continue the affair without guilt.
Sign number 4. Your intimate life changes dramatically in specific ways. Many women assume that if a man is having an affair, his interest in sex at home will decrease, and often that's true. But sometimes the pattern is more complex. Some men become more interested in sex, trying new things or requesting different activities because they're being sexually activated by someone else and redirecting that energy home. Others become less interested, but also less connected. Sex becomes perfunctory, emotionally empty, a physical transaction rather than intimate connection. Dr. Tammy Nelson, sex therapist who specializes in infidelity, explains that affairs almost always affect the sexual relationship at home, but not always in the expected ways. The key is watching for significant changes, either increases or decreases, especially when combined with emotional disconnection. Helen noticed that Richard's sexual interest in her had declined, but that wasn't the most telling sign. The more significant change was that when they were intimate, Richard was emotionally absent. He'd avoid eye contact. He wouldn't talk during or after. The connection that had always been part of their intimate life had disappeared, leaving just mechanical physical activity. When Helen tried to address this, Richard dismissed her concerns. "We're just getting older. Things change. You're expecting too much emotional intensity." But Helen knew the difference between normal aging and complete emotional disconnection. Barbara experienced the opposite with Martin. Suddenly, after their intimate life had settled into comfortable routine, Martin became sexually adventurous in ways that seemed out of character. He wanted to try new positions, new activities, things he'd never been interested in before. At first, Barbara thought this was positive, but looking back, she realized Martin was bringing home sexual interests that had been awakened by someone else and redirecting that energy home. Linda noticed a different pattern with Thomas. Their intimate life didn't decrease in frequency, but Thomas seemed distracted during it. He'd seemed to be going through the motions without being fully present. Sometimes he'd finish quickly, as though he were completing a task, rather than connecting with Linda. The quality of their intimacy had changed, even though the quantity remained similar. Dorothy, experienced with Michael, was the most common pattern: sudden, significant decrease in interest. Michael would make excuses. He was tired, stressed, not feeling well. When they were intimate, Michael seemed like he was forcing himself, fulfilling an obligation. Dorothy internalized this as her own inadequacy. Maybe she wasn't attractive enough anymore. Maybe this was just normal aging. She didn't consider that Michael's interest hadn't disappeared. It had just redirected to someone else. Patricia saw yet another warning sign with David. After years of David initiating intimacy regularly, suddenly he stopped initiating entirely. If they were going to be intimate, Patricia had to initiate. David was responsive, but passive.
This shift indicated David's emotional investment had moved elsewhere. He'd still participate if Patricia initiated, but he was no longer seeking connection with her. Here's the pattern. Significant changes in your intimate life, especially changes that come with emotional disconnection. This could be decreased interest, increased interest, changed preferences, emotional absence during intimacy, or shifted initiation patterns. The key is that something feels fundamentally different, and when you try to discuss it, he dismisses your concerns or makes you feel like you're overreacting.
Sign number 5. He becomes emotionally distant while simultaneously being vague about his time and activities. This is perhaps the most consistent sign across all affairs. Emotional withdrawal combined with decreased transparency about schedule and whereabouts. He's less interested in your life, less communicative about his, and increasingly vague when you ask basic questions about his day or plans. Margaret noticed this with Robert. Robert had always been open about his schedule, where he was going, who he'd be with, when he'd be home. Suddenly, Robert's explanations became vague. "I'll be out for a while," instead of, "I'm going to meet John for coffee at 3. "I've got some errands to run," instead of specifying what errands. When Margaret would ask for more specifics, Robert would get irritated. "Why do you need to know every detail? I'm just out running errands." Simultaneously, Robert became less interested in Margaret's life. He'd stopped asking about her day. He didn't engage when she talked about her activities or concerns. Conversations became surface level and functional rather than deep and connecting. Dr. Esther Perel explains that affairs require emotional energy and time that gets diverted away from the primary relationship. The affair partner is receiving the attention, curiosity, and emotional engagement that used to be directed at the spouse. What remains for the spouse is distracted attention, minimal engagement, surface-level interaction. Linda experienced this with Thomas in a specific way. Thomas started having frequent, unexplained absences. He'd go to the gym for 3 hours. He'd run errands that should take 30 minutes, but be gone for 2 hours. When Linda would comment on how long he'd been gone, Thomas would become defensive. "I ran into someone and we chatted," or "traffic was bad," or "I had to go to multiple stores." Each explanation was plausible individually, but the pattern was consistent. Thomas's time was increasingly unaccounted for, and he resented being asked about it. Carol noticed that Kenneth had become emotionally distant specifically around conversations about the future. Previously, Kenneth had enjoyed making plans, weekend trips, holiday plans, future goals. Suddenly, Kenneth avoided these conversations. He'd say things like, "Let's just take things one day at a time," or "I don't like to plan too far ahead." Carol thought this was a commitment issue, which it was, but the reason was that Kenneth was emotionally invested in someone else and couldn't authentically plan a future with Carol. Dorothy saw emotional distance manifest as lack of interest in resolving conflicts. Previously, if she and Michael had a disagreement, both would work to resolve it. Suddenly, Michael seemed indifferent. He'd end conflicts by just walking away or agreeing perfunctorily without actually engaging. Dorothy thought Michael was becoming more laid back. Actually, Michael had stopped being emotionally invested enough to fight for the relationship. Barbara experienced emotional distance as Martin becoming a stranger. They'd lived together for 18 months, knew each other deeply. Then suddenly, Barbara felt like she didn't know Martin at all. His moods were unpredictable. His explanations didn't quite add up. He seemed to be living a parallel life she had no access to. When she tried to express this feeling, Martin made her feel crazy. "You're being paranoid. Nothing has changed." Here's the pattern. He becomes less engaged in your life, less interested in your thoughts and feelings, less communicative about his own life. His schedule becomes vague and unaccounted for time increases. He resists questions about where he's been or what he's been doing. Plans for the future become uncomfortable topics he avoids. You feel increasingly like you're living with a stranger, or like there's a wall between you that wasn't there before.
Here's what all 5 of these signs reveal. Affairs don't happen in a vacuum. They're preceded by behavioral changes that indicate emotional and often physical investment elsewhere. The tragedy is that women frequently see these signs but explain them away because confronting the possibility of betrayal is terrifying and painful. Barbara, Linda, Margaret, Patricia, Helen, Dorothy, Carol, all of these women saw signs before discovering the affairs. Some recognized the signs in time to address the underlying issues. Others explained the signs away until the affair was discovered and the damage was extensive. Here's what you need to understand. These signs don't necessarily prove an affair is happening, but they do prove that something fundamental has changed in the relationship, and that change needs to be addressed. Whether it's an affair or not, the behavioral patterns described above indicate serious relationship problems that won't resolve themselves. If you're seeing multiple signs from this list, you need to have a direct conversation. Not an accusatory confrontation, but a clear statement. I've noticed these specific changes in your behavior. These changes concern me, and I need us to talk honestly about what's happening in our relationship. Pay attention to how he responds. The man who's not hiding anything will take your concerns seriously, will explain the changes, and will work with you to address whatever's causing the distance. The man who is hiding something will deflect, get angry, accuse you of being paranoid or controlling, and refuse to engage in honest conversation about your concerns. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, something is wrong. At 60 and beyond, you've lived long enough to know the difference between normal relationship evolution and fundamental betrayal. Don't gaslight yourself by explaining away obvious red flags. Leave a comment below if you've experienced any of these signs. Share this video with women who need to understand what behavioral changes to watch for. You deserve honesty and respect, and you deserve to recognize when you're not getting it. I'll see you in the next video.